Good evening, everyone. My name is Kaylee Perret-Shaughnessy, and I am the director of the Whittier Birthplace here in Haverhill, Massachusetts. And we are very pleased to present our first in our fall virtual lecture series. This program is supported by a grant from the Bridge Street Foundation, a special initiative of Mass Humanities. So thank you, Mass Humanities. Tonight, our speaker is Joanie DiMartino. She's of the Prudence Crandall Museum, and she's going to be speaking about the 19th century Canterbury female boarding school. Thank you, Joanie.
Thank you so much for having me this evening. I'm thrilled to be here and to share this story with a wider audience. It's I know it's hard to be on Zoom all the time, but the magic of virtual programming is that, I can really tell this story anywhere. And so I appreciate the technology that allows me to do that. Today I'm going to talk about a concept called equal school rights and the incidents that happened here at the Canterbury Female Boarding School between 1833 and 1834 really played a role in shaping the nation. The events here impacted two U.S. Supreme Court cases and laid the foundation for the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So it was pretty significant. And I'm going to be talking about a woman who is Connecticut's official state heroine, and her name was Prudence Crandall. And this is the most kind of known image of her. It's when she was younger. We do have photographs of her older, later in life. And this painting was done in 1834 at the height of the events that were happening here. It was commissioned by the American Anti-Slavery Society, and she went up to Boston and sat for the portrait. And then afterwards, the society would take the portrait around to their lectures and their bazaars and charge people to see it, because her court case was getting national and international attention, and nobody really knew what she looked like. So it was a way to do some early fundraising. But Crandall herself was born in Hopkinton, Rhode Island in 1803, and her parents had converted to Quakerism. And they moved to the Canterbury area to be closer to a Quaker community in the Plainfield area, which is up here in the northeast environs of Connecticut. And she ends up actually leaving the Quaker faith during the Second Great Awakening in around 1830. She becomes a Baptist, but that foundation of equality and the divine light of God being in everyone that the Quakers believed in is really the foundation of the decisions that she makes as she's running her school going forward. So because her parents are Quakers and they believe in equality, they educate their boys and their girls, their sons and their daughters, essentially equally. She is one of four children. She has an older brother named Hezekiah. She herself is the second oldest. She has a younger sister named Hannah Elmira, who went by Elmira, and a younger brother named Reuben. And she and Hannah Elmira go to Providence, Rhode Island, and they study at the Moses Brown School, which was a New England yearly annual Quaker meeting school at the time. Now it's named after Moses Brown, and it's still in existence. When she returns from attending school in Providence, she starts teaching in what we would call one-room schoolhouses today. During that time period, they were known as district schools because they were supported by the district. And she starts getting a good reputation as a teacher. And so the local town leaders in Canterbury ask her to start a school of higher education for their daughters. This is an image of Canterbury that was done by John Warner Barber, a sketch. This is approximately 1831 to 1834. And you can get a really good idea of what the center of Canterbury looked like at the time. You can see here the letter A, Miss Crandall's school. That is the building that she purchased. In New England, you may know this, the closer you lived to the Canterbury Green, to the town green, the more prominent you were. Your really kind of leading citizens tended to live toward the center of town. And so this actually is not church property. It is the town green. The church, the actual structure burned down in the 60s, the 1960s, but they rebuilt the church. So there is still a church, a congregational church that is on the green. And then over here is the town doctor, who I'll mention briefly later in the talk. But this house here was originally owned by a merchant named Luther Payne. It was built in 1805, and he had just died recently, and in the 1830s, and his estate puts the house for sale. So Crandall purchases it in 1831. The town gives her $500 down, and she has a mortgage that's held by a neighbor of $1,500, and she starts the school there. The town's demographics, their residents, their population is decreasing at this point because many people are going west to seek their fortunes. And so they're not staying in the area. And so the town is hoping that by Crandall starting this boarding school of higher education for young women, it's going to add some prominence to the town. It's going to encourage residents to stay, other residents and businesses to move into the area. So that's their goal of having Crandall start this school. And she does, and it's a successful school. There are her curriculum is on par with what young men are studying at this time. She's teaching astronomy. She has a chemistry lecturer coming on Tuesday evenings. She is teaching natural and moral philosophy. And she's not the only teacher there either. She has her sister Hannah Elmira, who is teaching with her. Mary Burley from Plainfield also comes to teach. Later, Mary's brother William is teaching at the school as well. So she's managing the school. She's serving as the principal and the owner. She's 28 years old. She owns the property outright because she's able to pay her mortgage off by January of 1832. And that's really important because that really allows her to determine what she wants to do with the school going forward. And she is she's like I said, she's a property owner, a business owner, and she's got a successful school that I know what I wanted to mention. She had about 25 students at this point in time. So she's charging for her full package menu at that point, because she did have some a la carte choices, was about $36 every 12 weeks when I did the math and added it all up. So you can see why she was able to pay off a $1,500 mortgage fairly quickly. But as I mentioned, she's managing the school, she's teaching some classes, and she needs some household assistance. So she hires a woman by the name of Mariah Davis, and it's pronounced Mariah, even though there's not an H at the end of her name. It is spelled that way. Mariah Davis is a free African-American young woman who is from Boston originally, and she has moved to the Canterbury area to be closer to the man she's engaged to marry. And he's a young man named Charles Harris. The Harris family has moved from Norwich, Connecticut to Canterbury to become farmers. And what's interesting about the Harris family is that they're an African-American family, and they're purchasing land, but it's in the mother's name. It's in Sally Prentice Harris's name, the land that they're purchasing. And I think that's so interesting. And scholars and historians are doing a lot of research on the Harris family, and they're not sure why that is, but we're just kind of conjecturing that maybe it's because William Monteflora Harris, the father, was from the West Indies, that maybe they were not trying to emphasize the Haiti connection because of the revolution that had taken place in Haiti previously. We're not sure. We're still doing research on the family. But William Harris, who I just mentioned, was a distributor for the Liberator. By September of 1831, he is listed as one of William Lloyd Garrison's distributors in the newspaper. And as you may know, the Liberator was an abolitionist newspaper that argued for immediate emancipation. And so Charles Harris is sharing this with Mariah Davis, who is bringing this newspaper to the school and sharing it with Prudence Crandall. Crandall was not a reformer Quaker. She was aware of the abolitionist movement, but she wasn't really participating in it at that point in time. So she is really getting an education from Mariah Davis, reading the Liberator. She's learning about not only the lives of enslaved people in the South, but also about the lives of free Black and brown people in the North. Just to give you some context here, Connecticut at this time is still a slave state. There are people enslaved in Connecticut while Crandall is running her school. Connecticut establishes in 1784 what is called gradual emancipation. And it essentially says that if an enslaved person is born after March 1st of 1784, they still must be enslaved for 25 years of their lives. So we really did not abolish slavery until 1848. And I'm embarrassed to tell you, Connecticut was the last state in New England to abolish slavery, to do so. So Crandall is starting to understand that even though these African-American families are free, they're by no means equal, and their citizenship is in question. There are people in the Connecticut legislature that do not view African Americans as citizens of the state of Connecticut. She's also reading, because William Lloyd Garrison is publishing at this point, the writings of Maria Stewart, who was a native of Hartford. And she was writing articles on the importance of education for African-American women. There were schools that were slowly being started at this time of higher education for Black men, but there were very minimal options for Black and brown women. There was a school in New Haven, Connecticut, that they tried to start for Black men, a manual school of labor, in 1831. And the opposition against it was so strong that when it went to a town vote, 700 men voted against it. And remember, it was all men because women couldn't vote at this point in time, and 4 men voted for it. So that's, it didn't even get off of the ground at that point. It didn't even get started. So there was a lot of disappointment. Abolitionists were putting their support behind the creation of that school. And then when that school failed, when Prudence Crandall is able to start her school, many of her supporters were original supporters of the school in New Haven. So getting back to Canterbury here, Prudence Crandall is having these conversations with Mariah Davis on what she's reading in the Liberator. And then also in that conversation is Sarah Harris. And Sarah Harris is Charles Harris's younger sister. And she's here, she's visiting the school often. She's, getting to know her soon-to-be sister-in-law, they're friends. And like I said, these 3 women are having conversations together. And Sarah Harris gets the courage to ask Prudence Crandall if she could attend the school as a full-time student. She also wants to be a teacher. She, at the time, was also in domestic service at a house, the Jedediah Shepherd household, which was about, I would say, maybe a block. It's, a block or 2 down from the Canterbury school. And, I can't emphasize enough the bravery and the agency of these 2 African-American women, with Mariah Davis bringing the Liberator to Crandall's, school and sharing it with her. And then also Sarah Harris, being courageous enough to ask to get a higher education. Sarah Harris, has to ask several times. Prudence Crandall does not say yes right away. She thinks about it for a while. But as she says herself in the Windham County Advertiser, when she's writing in 1833 defending her position, she says her repeated solicitations were more than I could bear, and I said to her, if there were any if there was any injury, and I'm paraphrasing as best I can here, that she would bear it. But so essentially, Crandall's saying that she knows that there may not be a good town response to Sarah Harris attending the school, but she ultimately makes the right decision. And when she does, she stands by that conviction. She, under a lot of pressure, does not even consider expelling Sarah Harris. And again, I think that's her Quaker faith, that foundation of, what, everybody's equal, everybody has the right to the education that they want or need to meet their own goals, to have their own agency. And she stands by that, and Sarah Harris does become the first African-American full-time student of the Canterbury Female Boarding School. Mariah Davis also sits in on classes after she's finished her tasks for the day. This is a photo of Sarah Harris that we have at the museum. Later in life, we don't have any images of Sarah Harris at the time that she attended the school. She was 20 years old at the time that she asked to become a student, and we have no images at all of Mariah Davis. So what starts happening is, the town starts putting pressure on Crandall fairly quickly to expel Sarah Harris. There's a minister's wife that meets with her and tells her that, her school is going to fail if she does not expel Harris. And Crandall's response is, well, that it might sink, for I shall not turn her out. And then there's a committee of men that meet with Crandall, again, putting more pressure on her to not teach Sarah Harris. And she remains firm in that conviction. But as the townspeople were predicting when they met with her, the parents do start withdrawing their daughters. We do not have any records of any negative responses from the white students themselves. They do not seem to have had a problem with Sarah Harris attending the classes. It was their families, their parents that did. And Crandall realizes fairly quickly that she's not going to be able to offer an education to Mariah Davis, Sarah Harris, or other women who want to attend the school if there's no school at all, that the school is kind of in danger of not succeeding. So she reaches out to William Lloyd Garrison, and she has an idea, and she writes him. And incidentally, this letter is part of Garrison's collection in the Boston Digital Commons, if anyone ever wants to look it up and read it directly. But she writes to him and says, "Sir, you do not know me. I am a principal of a very successful school, and I'm going to tell you why I'm writing you." She wants to change her student body from white students to non-white students. And she wants to reach out to other areas, so other cities. She doesn't think she can get enough Connecticut residents to make the school a success, maybe not be able to afford the tuition, because she still has to charge a tuition fee. But if he could help her reach out to other communities, she thinks she can make it a success. And she says in her letter too that she wants to spend the rest of her life helping the oppressed peoples. And while she does not have wealth, she can educate, and that's where she wants to make a difference. And then she follows up by saying, "I'm coming to Boston in a couple of days, and I'll let you know when I arrive." And she does. She goes up to Boston shortly afterwards. She leaves her sister Hannah Elmira in charge of the school, and she meets with William Lloyd Garrison, and he supports the idea of her starting this school for young African-American women. And what he does is writes her letters of introduction to African-American ministers in larger cities, such as Philadelphia, Providence, and New York City. And they then put her in touch with members of their congregation who are interested in sending their daughters to the school. And he also puts an advertisement in the Liberator, announcing that she is closing her school down to white students in March of 1833, and that she's going to reopen Monday next, which actually, through the magic of the internet, I did the research. It's actually April 1st of 1833. To what she puts in the advertisement here, young ladies and little misses of color. So it was for Black and brown young women. She does not change her curriculum. So you can see here everything she's teaching. It's almost exact of what she was teaching the white students. I think the only thing that may be missing off of this list is rhetoric. And she also changes it a little bit, so it's actually one package. So in other words, music on the piano is not an add-in extra, or French or drawing. These were kind of some of the, you could add them on for $2, you could add this or that, but I honestly suspect it was probably a just kind of a record keeping issue, that it was probably just easier to offer the whole package for $25. But you can also see what's more important, the list of the supporters that were supporting her school. Arthur Tappan, a very wealthy white abolitionist from New York, that funds a lot of what happens here as the events occur, as they try, the town and the state try to shut her school down. Reverend Peter Williams was an African-American minister from New York City. I won't read this whole list, but another two men I want to mention is Samuel Jocelyn. He was one of the leaders of trying to get the school in New Haven started that I mentioned earlier. And Reverend Samuel May becomes one of the school's largest supporters. And he was a Unitarian minister, and he was from Brooklyn, Connecticut, which is 6 miles up the road. If anyone is familiar with Connecticut's highways, it's 169. We are actually at the juncture of 169 and Route 14. And if you continue straight up 169, you can still see his church, which is there today. It's a Unitarian Universalist congregation. So he was nearby, and he becomes, actually, I'm going to show his picture first since I'm talking about him. He becomes, the strongest supporter. His memoirs, later he becomes the president of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and his memoirs are an excellent primary source of what happened here during that time period. But he's speaking at town meetings on the school's behalf. He's writing newspaper articles. He's raising funds. When the churches in this area close their doors to the students, he welcomes them to his church. He comes here and preaches sermons for them on Sundays. And of course, he's offering advice and helping Crandall network. And all of that is necessary because she is completely surrounded by people who do not support her. If you remember that first image of the town that I showed you, the town doctor lives right here across the street. He tells Crandall, don't bother calling me if any of the students fall ill. I'm not coming to help. The church over here is where they're having meetings to determine how they're going to close Crandall's school down. This house right here, which the state now owns, actually, we're going to be turning that into a visitor center about 7 years in the future. It's part of our long range plan. At the time of Crandall School, it was owned by a man named Rufus Adams. He was a justice of the peace. He's one of the committee people that meet with her to try to encourage her to expel Sarah Harris. He reads her arrest warrant to her and turns her over to the sheriff later. So you can see how small this community is here, and how Crandall is surrounded by everyone who is in opposition to her school. The house over here that's across the street from Route 14 is no longer in existence, but that was her lead opponent in all of this. And his name was Andrew Judson. He was very prominent. He was this Windham County state attorney, and he was in the state Senate. So he really uses all of his professional and political networks to close the school down. And he gets passed a law in 1833, 1 month after she starts accepting African-American students, and it becomes known as the Black Law. And the law essentially states that it is illegal for African-American students to enter the state of Connecticut for the purpose of receiving an education without prior town approval. So it's designed to close this school down. African Americans can enter the state to take a job, to buy property, whatever they want, except to get an education. So he knows that her students are coming from out of state. And so that's why he has this law passed. One of the students wrote to William Lloyd Garrison, and he was publishing their articles and their letters in the Liberator. And she writes, "Last evening, the news reached us that the new law had passed. The bell rang and a cannon was fired for a half an hour. Where is justice?" Now they're celebrating right across the street from the school in the Canterbury Green in front of the church in that sketch that I had showed you a few moments ago. So that's, you know, the town's response and their encouragement in having this law passed. It was actually an addendum to a vagrancy law that they attempted to utilize against the students to kind of run them out of town. But Arthur Tappan, who I mentioned earlier, helps by putting $1,000 bond down to the town, saying that the students, even though they could afford the tuition and even though they were, you know, they had a place to stay, the town was accusing them of being a burden, a financial burden on the town. And Arthur Tappan said, you know, no, here's $1,000. These students will not be a burden on the town. So that's when Judson works to get this addendum to that law passed. Prudence, Crandall, and the students, by still continuing to run the school, by the time this law is passed, there are 13 students at the school, and scholars have been able to locate the names of about 27 African-American students who attended the school. But, you know, by still attending and learning, and Crandall and her sister teaching, they're participating in essentially nonviolent civil disobedience. They're saying that this law is unfair and I'm not going to recognize it. I'm going to still do what I do because this is what is important. And so Crandall, as I mentioned, does get arrested. And as a matter of fact, her sister gets arrested as well, but her sister is a minor, so she gets released. But Crandall spends one night in jail. And then the abolitionists pay her bond, and she has to go to court. During this time, there's like a two-pronged approach to closing Crandall's school down. You have this legal prosecution that has started, but what has already been occurring is a continual harassment and intimidation of Crandall and the students that increases throughout the 17 months that she manages to keep the school open. And they're throwing eggs at the school. They're throwing rocks through the windows. There is filth that is smeared on the front steps of the school. William Burley, who was one of the male teachers, obviously he is not spending the night at the school. When he leaves in the evenings, he is egged. They throw eggs at him. And that violence and that intimidation increases. So there's the well where they're getting their drinking water on Crandall's property. There is horse manure thrown in that well, so they don't have fresh drinking water. When Crandall's father brings them casks of water from his well, he is threatened with physical violence and a fine, but he is determined to assist the school. And so he doesn't care, he brings them water anyway. There is a cat that has black and white fur that is found on their fence with its throat slit. There is an arson attempt against the school, and we have found during the restoration charred beams from that attempt to set the school on fire. And we will eventually have that on display under plexiglass. But that's a whole nother story, because that happens on the afternoon of January 28th, 1834. And there's another African-American man on site that day. His name is Frederick Oney, and he is friends with the Harris family, and he's assisting the school in many different ways. One is that he is going to different towns and purchasing supplies because the stores in the town will not sell to the school. And he has just arrived from New York City delivering a care package for one of the students. And he is in the front room and he's writing a note to the mother saying, your daughter's fine, package was delivered safely. And a student comes downstairs and says that she smells smoke. And immediately he starts looking around and he discovers that it's actually on the outside of the room that he is in. It's in the corner of the building. And so he sends the students out of the building, has them ring the bell on the green to call, the fire, sound the fire alarm. And the residents of the town come out and they do help put the fire out. It's not because they like the school, it's because they fear fire more. They don't want the embers being blown to their own buildings and burn down their barn or part of their house. So that's the only reason that they help put out the fire. They then promptly arrest Frederick Oney 2 weeks later for setting the fire. And they claimed that because he knew where it was, and that Prudence Crandall probably hired him to start the fire. But putting him through a trial where he was, potentially facing, a capital punishment, was another way to terrorize the African-American community. He does get acquitted, and that's because the mother who sends the care package comes all the way up here from New York City to testify on his behalf. His trial records, because the students are testifying where they were and what they were doing at the time, is one of the rare moments where we actually see an image, get an idea of what was going on at the school at a particular moment in time. But that's his trial takes place in the middle of Crandall's trials. And there is a clause that gets added to the Black law when it's written, Section 3, that doesn't get talked about much, but it essentially says that the students have to testify on behalf of the prosecution. So her neighbor across the street who gets the Black law passed, Andrew Judson, is serving as her trial lawyer, her prosecuting attorney. And he's arguing essentially that there's this law, she broke the law, she should face the consequences of her actions. But that's not what her defense is arguing. Her defense is saying it doesn't matter whether or not Prudence Crandall broke this law. The law is unconstitutional. These students are citizens of the United States. They are born free in the North. They are citizens of the states where they are from. They should have the choice to go to school wherever they want, wherever they can afford to do so. And Judson is bringing the students to the witness stand, essentially expecting them to admit that they're in this school and testify against their teacher. And they have been advised to plead their Fifth Amendment rights. And that's what they do. They get to the witness stand and say that they are not answering any of the questions. They do not want to incriminate themselves. They are claiming their Fifth Amendment rights. And they almost save the day. They're really the heroes of this trial. They're between the ages of 15 and 20 years old. They're probably the least privileged people in society, facing a completely hostile courtroom situation where pretty much everyone is, against their learning, mostly wealthy white males that are in this courtroom. And these young Black and brown women get up to the witness stand and say, I'm not answering your questions. And they end up with what was called a hung jury, which meant that the jury was not unanimous. 7 voted to convict and 5 people voted to acquit. So they were almost successful. Because of that, there is a second trial where Crandall is convicted, and her defense immediately appeals. So when the case goes to the appeals trial, it gets handed down the decision in Hartford. And at this point, there are several judges that are determining on whether or not the conviction should stand. And I want to mention too that Judson at the second trial gets another judge named David Daggett to sit in as the judge on Crandall's second trial. He happens to be the person that led the opposition to the New Haven school. So he is not going to be sympathetic at all. He also, David Daggett, maneuvers himself in a clear conflict of interest to be on the appeals panel as well, to be one of those 4 judges. So he is with a panel of other judges, 3 other judges that have to determine whether or not his conviction stands. So when you go to an appeals trial at this point, it's simply the defense and the prosecution arguing their case. So what I find particularly interesting about this is that the voices of the women are no longer present when it goes to the appeals court trial. So you have the wealthiest, most privileged people in society determining whether or not African-American women can go to school where they want, and whether or not white women can teach whomever they want with the voices of these women absent. The judges kind of have 2 things going on here. The first is that they realize that the abolitionists will appeal another conviction, and the goal of the abolitionists at this point is to get this trial to the United States Supreme Court. They want the determination for African-American citizenship to be determined on a federal level. So the judges don't want to see this happen. They also do not want to acquit Crandall because they do not want to go against David Daggett, who is also on this panel. He's a senior judge. He clearly has political clout, and they do not want to ruin their careers. And they probably don't want to see Crandall acquitted. So what they do is they decide to dismiss the case on a technicality. They claim that the arrest warrant was not written up correctly. Essentially, Crandall can still run her school. You know, the determination is they throw it out of court. She can still be arrested and have to go through this process all over again. But the abolitionists are disappointed they can't appeal this case further. But the town is incensed because she can still run her school. Their legal avenue has been closed down. She has managed to keep the school open all of these months. If they rearrest her and go through this lengthy process again, she will continue to run her school. So on the night of September 9th, 1834, a mob attacks the school and they destroy almost all of the windows. It seems, depending on what primary source, they got into the first floor, ransacked it, destroyed items and furniture. Beyond the terror and the trauma that they experienced that evening, the students were not physically harmed. But it was very clear, as I mentioned earlier, this pattern of escalation of violence, that there was going to be another time. So that was when Crandall made the determination to close the school down. She could no longer guarantee the safety of the students, and she thought it was best to send them back to their families at that point and close the school. Crandall's legacy, the legacy of the Canterbury female boarding school, is really twofold. It's what the students went on to do, and then it's the legacy of what Crandall versus Connecticut goes on to do. And this is a photograph of Crandall about 30 years after the events that took place here. At least 5 of her students went on to become teachers and leaders. Many of them became leaders, but 5 of them became teachers. And I'll talk about a few of them. Just for example, Sarah Harris, who was the first African-American student who attended the school, she married a blacksmith named George Fayerweather. And they eventually moved to Kingston, Rhode Island, which is where his family was from. They participate in anti-slavery conventions. Their house is a stop on the Underground Railroad. She continues to work with William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. She stays in touch with Crandall throughout their lives. she names her first daughter actually Prudence Crandall Fairweather. So I mean that's how close these women were. They were very good friends. She even goes out to Kansas to visit Crandall much later in life, but she becomes a very noted reformer. Her sister Mary Harris, I'm gonna bring up her picture here. This is, of course, Mary Harris later in life as well. She's Sarah Harris's younger sister. She becomes a teacher. She marries Pelman Williams, who is a teacher from Norwich, Connecticut, where the Harris family was originally from. And they go down to New Orleans during the Civil War and start teaching the newly freed African Americans. And they become so noted as teachers that they are asked to start a college, and they start Straight College. Mary is teaching in the English department. Pelman is overseeing the teachers college, and Straight College eventually becomes Dillard University, which is a recognized HBCU, historically Black college and university today. So and her descendants, her sons and daughters and other descendants also become well-known teachers and musicians in New Orleans as well. So the legacy of education really is represented, I think, by Mary Harris. Going back to this here, two other students that we know more about after their time here at the school. Mary Miles continues her education in Massachusetts, and she is involved in anti-slavery conventions where she meets Henry Bibb. And Henry Bibb is a self-emancipated man, and he has written a narrative about his time being enslaved in Kentucky. And so he is giving lectures about his narrative and the book that he wrote. They marry in 1848. 2 years later, the Fugitive Slave Law gets passed, and he's in danger. So they flee to Canada. They start what they call the Home Refugee Society, which is essentially the last spot on the Underground Railroad. And they start a newspaper. She starts a school. They are recognized by the Canadian government today. There's a marker that honors them. And in 2021, they dedicated a park to Mary Miles Bibb, which I think is interesting because it's not to the both of them. The marker is, but the park is just named after her. Incidentally, too, I was contacted recently by an organization that is putting a monument to women's history, I believe in Minuteman Park, or it's somewhere nearby the Buckman Tavern. But they contacted me because Mary Miles Bibb is going to be one of the women honored on that monument. So I don't know if you have any, because I know you're in Massachusetts, if you have any connections with that organization, but I did want to let you know that. And the last student that I'll mention is Julia Williams. She attends the Noyes Academy in Canaan, New Hampshire. And that academy also gets closed due to white mob violence. What they do there is they put a large chain around the school, hook up about 95 oxen to it, and physically pull it off the foundation down the street and set it on fire. The students were able to safely escape to sympathetic townspeople's houses. It was just a situation very similar to what happened here in Canterbury. The Noyes Academy was integrated, and it was also co-ed. So Julia meets there the man that she is eventually going to marry. His name is Henry Highland Garnett. And they don't start courting then, but they reconnect several years later when they both finish their education at the Oneida Institute in New York. And he becomes a minister, and she's managing the congregation while he is on the lecture circuit. He is a contemporary of Frederick Douglass, and he credits Julia in his memoirs with writing some of his speeches. But they go to Jamaica for a little while, for several years, as missionaries. And she starts a school down there, a female industrial school, where she serves as principal. When they return to the United States, he becomes the first African-American minister to preach a sermon before the United States Congress. So she is probably the most prominent student of the Canterbury Female Boarding School during her lifetime. And believe it or not, we've still not been able to locate photographs of either Julia Williams Garnett or Mary Miles Bibb. And I'm just hopeful that they're in archives somewhere and have not been discovered yet. We have pictures of their husbands, or someone's attic, but we just still have not been able to locate those images. William Ellsworth, you may remember me mentioning earlier, he served as Crandall's defense attorney. He becomes governor of Connecticut 4 years after he argues her case in 1838. He's sworn in May, and by the end of May, he has the Black Law repealed. His arguments for Crandall's appeals case become the foundation for the 14th Amendment. And I'm going to just read these to you, just the first lines. This is Ellsworth's arguments. These pupils are human beings born in these states and owe the same obligation to the state and the state's governments as white citizens. And then section 1, the first line right here reads, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the states wherein they reside. And just to refresh everyone's memory, the 14th Amendment, the first clause, the first section is the amendment that says that if you are born or naturalized in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. It's one of the 3 Reconstruction amendments that get passed after the Civil War. The first is the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery throughout the United States. The 14th Amendment gives citizenship, and the 15th Amendment gives Black men the right to vote. So the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, and Connecticut actually does become the first state to ratify the 14th Amendment. But we know that the 14th Amendment is an outcome of Crandall's court case, because the 2 U.S. Supreme Court cases that Crandall's case impacted really span. It's like the absolute worst decision that the United States Supreme Court has ever determined, which was the Dred Scott case, which is when the citizenship case finally reaches the federal court for African-American citizenship. And of course, they deny citizenship to Dred Scott. Roger Taney, who is the Chief Justice at the time, when he hands down that decision, actually says that, well, because in Crandall versus Connecticut, Connecticut, which at that time was a free state and in the North, did not recognize the citizenship of African Americans. Therefore, that should serve as the precedent for the nation. Crandall was alive at the time that this decision was handed down. She was living in Illinois. We don't know if she knew that her court case had served as the reason for his decision. But many years later, in 1954, with Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund had hired constitutional scholar Howard J. Graham to research the 14th Amendment. And he is the one that determined that Ellsworth's arguments were the genesis, as he calls it, for the 14th Amendment. So when Chief Counsel Thurgood Marshall is preparing his arguments, his written arguments, before he makes his oral arguments to the Supreme Court, he writes, and I'm quoting, "The first comprehensive crystallization of anti-slavery constitutional theory occurred in 1834 in the arguments of W.W. Ellsworth and Calvin Goddard, 2 of the outstanding lawyers and statesmen of Connecticut, on the appeal of the conviction of Prudence Crandall." So while I said, we didn't serve as precedent for Brown, we do impact that Supreme Court case. And so it's just amazing to me that over a century later, what happened here in the building I'm actually speaking to you from now, because I'm in my office in the school, the museum, impacts education for millions of Americans. It's a very humbling place to be. And that pretty much ends up my talk. I just want to wrap up by just reiterating that, Prudence Crandall, as I mentioned, is the state heroine of Connecticut. And there is a scholar who's written what will be the next definitive bio of Prudence Crandall. Her name is Jennifer Rasenga, and her manuscript is with a university press right now. But she argues that Crandall is the official state heroine of Connecticut, not for what she did, but for what we still need to aspire to be, that the work here really is not done. Prudence Crandall worked with Sarah Harrison, with Mariah Davis, these two African-American women who had, their own agency and their own goals, and who worked on their own behalf for education. And so, what happened here is really a model for us to, collaboratively work together going forward to continue to advance equality and equity in education. Prudence Crandall's court trials were connected to the civil rights movement in the 20th century, and that the students who attended the school went on to become reformers, educators, and leaders in their own right. And this is just a little bit of information about me. If you'd like to contact me, a little bit about the mission and the vision of the museum. And again, I just want to thank you so very much. I want to thank Massachusetts Humanities and the Whittier Birthplace for having me today and allowing me to share this amazing story with you all this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanie. That was great.
Thank you.
I'll open the floor up to questions if anybody has them. We're a small group, so feel free to take yourself off mute and ask. If you'd rather type it in the chat, I can read it out loud as well.
Well, Kaylee, I'd like to, this is Arthur Veazey, and I work with Kaylee at the Whittier Birthplace. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees, and I just want to thank you for a most interesting lecture tonight. And next time I'm down in Northeast Connecticut, I may swing by and see if I can visit your nice town and see some of what we learned about tonight. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Well, I have a question, actually, a little bit more about the museum side than the history side, but the town of Canterbury was not very welcoming of the school originally. How are your relationships with the community today?
They're great today. Yeah, I have a good relationship with the town first selectman. He's, given talks here. Most of our volunteers come from the area. I get a lot of people that, and I think we're all guilty of it. Gosh, I've lived here all my life and I've never visited the museum. So, you never kind of come visit what's local. So I do get a lot of local people that will come and, kind of be a little sheepish, like, I'm so sorry I haven't been here before, but that's okay. It happens. I do the same thing. But yeah, no, most of our, like I said, our volunteers are local, and I think we have a very good relationship with the town now. They're very proud of, the history that happened here. And honestly, it could have happened anywhere in the state of Connecticut. And like I said, it happened in New Haven. And, while yes, the opposition to the school, did occur from townspeople and frankly, other nearby towns as well, both Crandall and Harris were also Canterbury locals as well. And, they can lay claim to them, absolutely.
Any other questions? Well, if there's not, thank you again for a wonderful presentation. For those of you who are interested, we do have another virtual lecture coming up in October on the 27th. We will have a partial reading of John Greenleaf Whittier's poem, The Witch of Wenham, in honor of Halloween. And we will have a presenter from the Wenham Museum speaking about the real life witch trials that inspired Whittier's poem. So please join us then. Information is on our website to sign up, just like you did today. And thank you and good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night.